Before my NDE, leading up to that, I was 54 years old, had studied conventional neuroscience, neurosurgery through the 20th and early 21st century. Thought I had some idea of how brain, mind, and consciousness work, but I was hamstrung by the limits of materialism or physicalism, which tries to pretend that the brain creates consciousness out of physical matter, and that's the end of the story. That's what I believed, and I was in for the journey of a lifetime to show me that I was on the wrong track, and that the nature of consciousness was a much bigger part of the universe at large than anything I ever could have imagined before. Now, important to point out that one of the major features of my near-death experience was the fact that I was amnesic, that during this entire 7-day coma, I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life. And that's very unusual. In fact, I really haven't encountered it to that degree in any other NDE I've ever studied. And I've studied thousands of them. But I think the reason is you got to remember that NDEs are always tailored for the individual who's having them. And in my case, a neurosurgeon very fascinated by consciousness and the nature of reality, I had to go to a particularly deep dive. And that was also an unusual dive with this amnesia. When I first came back to the world, in the first few weeks of trying to make sense of it all, I explained the amnesia by I was beginning to glean some of the facts of the medical parameters of my case and how damaged my neocortex was. So still harboring my old and incorrect versions of, the memory is stored in the brain and that kind of thing. I thought, well, I guess given the damage to my neocortex, that might explain that disappearance of memories. But what was shocking in those weeks and months after coma was how quickly all the memories were coming back, and that in fact they were more complete than they had been before. So very clear evidence they weren't stored in the brain in the first place, but that I was accessing an information space beyond physical space-time to get to that. So now, getting into the journey itself, started at 4:30 in the morning, November 10th, 2008, severe back pain, severe headache, soon grand mal seizures, and lapsing into coma. There's a myth out there perpetuated by an irresponsible journalist that this is a medically induced coma. That is not the case. The reason the scientific world takes my story so seriously is because of all the details of the meningitis-induced coma and the fact that there's a medical case report that validates and supports all of what I promoted in the book Proof of Heaven, but that case report was written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. The case report is in Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018, and it makes the point that my brain was in no shape to harbor any dream or hallucination, which was the same conclusion I reached in looking at medical parameters, trying to analyze my case. It didn't make sense. It violated everything modern neuroscience says about the role of the neocortex in creating consciousness. So now to dive deeply into what I remembered of the experience, it started in what I call the earthworm eye view, very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. But I was rescued from that by this slowly spinning white light that came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And that opened up into this rich, ultra-real gateway valley, much more real than this world. That's a mistake people make, is thinking that near-death experiences would be murky and dreamlike. Well, this existence in these bodies in the material world is murky and dreamlike by comparison. As most near-death experiencers will tell you, in those realms, it's way too real to be real. Those were the words I used in describing it to my son. At the time, I thought I was describing some vast hallucination because my doctors had told me the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. So I was trying to explain all this in those early days. But so at that beginning stage, I went from that up into that beautiful Gateway Valley. That was where we would have life reviews. That's a timeless realm where you can have birth, death, everything in between shown to you simultaneously. So it's clearly a realm that's risen way up outside of our normal kind of narrative of Earth time, and those causal connections between events. And so in that Gateway Valley, absolutely beautiful, sparkling waterfalls into crystal blue pools, this perfect, pristine meadow surrounded by a forest. Down below, thousands of beings dancing in this meadow, lots of joy and festivities. I remember children playing, dogs jumping, incredible joy and mirth, all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants, anthems, hymns that would thunder through my awareness. And the best thing about this part of the journey in the Gateway Valley was I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman beside me, sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile. She never said a word. She never had to, but her mind melded directly into my awareness, and I knew her deep truth. And that was what the words that I used to explain that, convey that conceptual reality that was presented to me. A message from her to me that I think was the main message I was to bring back to this world. You were deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You were richly cared for. And I cannot tell you how liberating and refreshing that message was in that moment. And then what I witnessed was the soft summer breeze that blew through. That was my first awareness in this amnesic state of that infinitely loving God force at the core of all creation. And I remember all of this scene around me, this beautiful kind of scripted scene of this idyllic world collapsing down. All of four-dimensional space-time collapsed down. Then all of this richer kind of spiritual realm where you can have all the events of your life simultaneously presented. All of that collapsed down until I was left in what I call the core. I ascended through yet another portal, musical portal. This one was created by the angelic choirs that were fueling all the festivities in that realm. And as all of that collapsed down and I entered the core, I was told, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things. You'll be going back. And there were many lessons conveyed through all these levels, pretty much all of it based on how this consciousness is fundamental and that power of love and how we're all in this together. And as I entered that core realm, as I called it, that was the furthest I went on my journey. All dualities resolve. You know, in our world, we have dualities of good, bad, darkness, light, masculine, feminine, etc. All these different kind of spectra. And all of those come into oneness in that core realm. And in fact, I even came to realize that the very source of my conscious awareness was that God force of creation at the core of the universe that so many near-death experiences have encountered. And I certainly encountered it going through the Gateway Valley and especially into the core realm, and acknowledging that we're never any distance at all from that infinitely loving and healing force of wholeness, that God force. More than 90% of near-death experiencers across all history, across all belief systems, no matter if they were previously an agnostic or atheist or whatever religion, more than 90% of them after this experience come back not just believing, but knowing the reality of a loving force at the core of the universe. And for me, coming back to this world, the word God was a puny little human word with a lot of baggage. And so in the book Proof of Heaven, I actually labeled that force that I encountered Om, because that was the resonance that I felt, heard, and became one with in that core realm, was that Om sound. And I realized it doesn't matter if you're trying to call this entity God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, all the many names that people have attached to it. But the reality is near-death experiences reveal is that God force is absolutely real at the core of this universe, at the core of our very existence. And it unifies us. We're all sharing that God mind. So we're all in this together. In many ways, the golden rule is written into the fabric of the universe through life reviews. You know, you've heard your life flashing before your eyes. Well, life reviews go back thousands of years across all belief systems. And those life reviews are very strong evidence that we're in this together. Because you'll find in a major study, for example, Bruce Grayson, a skeptical MD who's studied these things for 45 years, he finds that something like 75% of life reviews involve people witnessing the events of their life from the perspective of everybody involved. So it's not just from their own perspective. So if you've been busy handing out pain and suffering to others, being greedy or selfish, you get on the business end of that during the life review, and it shows you how poorly that kind of behavior can feel to other people. So it nudges us gently towards loving each other, caring for each other, as if to hurt another is to hurt oneself. You know, treat others as you would like to be treated. That is written into the very fabric of the universe through these beautiful lessons. So it turns out back in my journey, I would spontaneously tumble back down to that earthworm eye view where it all began. And I quickly discovered by remembering the musical notes of the melody that was associated with that musical portal, with that wormhole that led up into the brilliant ultra real Gateway Valley, by remembering and going through those musical notes in my mind, I could conjure up that light portal and get back up into that beautiful scene. And then those angelic choirs took me beyond that. And I was always welcomed in that Gateway Valley realm by the beautiful guardian angel. And those who have read the book Proof of Heaven realize how important that guardian angel was, because 4 months after my coma, I received a picture in the mail that had to do with my adoption history, that I'd been put up for adoption when I was 11 days old. My birth mother was 16 and unwed, but she was unwilling to sign the papers to give me away, which she finally did when I was 4 weeks old. And through much of my life, that kind of adoption story had become this subconscious knowing that maybe I wasn't even worthy of existence if my own mother had left me behind. And so in many ways, this NDE was a beautiful resolution of that lifelong challenge of the adoption abandonment wound. And it turns out, towards the very end of this journey of deep in coma over 7 days, due to bacterial meningoencephalitis, towards the very end of it, I could no longer conjure up that light portal and the musical melodies that would make that light portal appear. And to say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but I knew I could trust in the universe, that I would be taken care of, that I had been promised every passage through that Gateway Valley. Then I saw thousands of beings going off into the distance all around me, heads bowed, murmuring energy coming from them as they were saying some kind of a incantation or prayer. And what I called all of that when I came back to the world was I was witnessing the power of prayer, as all these beings were basically kind of drawing me back to this world. And then there were 6 faces I saw at the very end of the journey. 5 of them were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours of coma. Very importantly, many family and friends who had been there earlier in the week were not in my memories at all. So what this helped to do was prove that majority of my spiritual experience deep in coma had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of the 7-day coma. I explain all that timing in the book Proof of Heaven. But the reality is, I was headed back for this world. And the last face I saw was a 10-year-old boy. I didn't recognize him at the time because my amnesia was still in force. It was my son, Bond. And that's a very appropriate name, far more appropriate than I ever recognized before my coma, because he became my bond to this earth. And that's what really brought me back. And it was day 7 of coma. The doctors had held a family conference that Sunday morning saying I'd gone from 10% chance of survival down to 2% with no chance of recovery. And Bond overheard that. They had protected him from the worst news during the week, but now he heard that, knew things were much worse than he'd been told. He came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids, one pupil looking over there, one over there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows what a bad picture that is. And I promise you, I didn't see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears. I was far too gone from this world. But his pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. He didn't understand the words, but somehow that got through. And even though this entire journey, because of that amnesia, I thought this can continue, it can cease, it doesn't matter. Now, all of a sudden, with recognizing Bond as a soul near and dear to me, all of a sudden it was very important. And I didn't understand the rules of all this, but somehow I had to get back to help him. And that it was my love for Bond, sensed through that presence of his pleading with me to come back. That's what drew me back to this world. And when I first came back to the world, my brain was still very impacted by the meningitis. In fact, I had a 36-hour paranoid delusional psychotic nightmare after they pulled out the breathing tube, after I woke up, but I was still very much affected by it all. And the interesting thing is all the deep coma memories from the time when my brain was completely inactivated, according to the medical parameters of the case, those memories are as sharp and clear as if the whole thing happened yesterday. The memories of that psychotic nightmare that happened on and off for 36 hours after I started waking up, those memories disappeared within weeks. And I'm glad I wrote a lot of it down, because that's really the only source I have for any of the information on that. But I've spent the 15 years since my coma. It's important to point out it took 2 months basically for all the memories to come back. And as we discussed in our 3rd book, Living in a Mindful Universe, those memories were even more complete than they had been before coma. Again, more evidence that memories are not stored in the brain, something neurosurgeons have suspected for a long time because there's never been a brain resection in the last 100 years or so where we had a swath of long-term memories that were removed with the brain. It just doesn't happen. Even in cases of hemispherectomy in very young children with seizures who can have half their brain removed to control the seizures, they don't lose any long-term memories with that resection of brain. So we've come to recognize that major fact. It's one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience that memories are not stored in the brain, but that's a deep truth of our modern experience. So that's basically what I went through, and it kind of forced me to re-examine everything I'd ever thought I knew about the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, and of the mind-brain relationship.
Wow. You know this story by heart, sir. You told it probably at least a
Been
couple
there, done
hundred
that.
times. Yeah.
Don't have the T-shirt though.
You got
Been there, done that. I've got the T-shirt to prove it. You
that's
can't
the
have a
saying.
T-shirt for something like this.
So you described that the other side was more real than this side here.
Just look at the way that thousands of near-death experiencers describe the experience is way too real to be real, much more real than the events of this lifetime. But then, of course, when you listen more, it's not like they're in a world like you and I are right now, just talking in this narrative of understanding. They're in a realm where they can be experiencing birth, death, everything in between, all the major events of their life. It's all simultaneously presented. So the relationships and the kind of reasons for different things happening can be so much clearer when we have that gigantic kind of whole life view of it all. And then things start to fall into place and make sense. For many of us, the challenges and hardships in life, why me? Why did this thing happen to me? Well, it turns out when you have that much bigger perspective, you realize that often the challenges and hardships, illness, injury, what have you, were the great contributors to our soul growth. It was the challenges that led to our strengthening. As Nietzsche said, that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Well, in our lives, we face challenges and they temper the steel. They help us to grow. And that was something that was very clear to me in coming back from my coma journey. I came to see some of the things in my life, like the adoption, the fact that I gave up alcohol back in 1991, very early in my career. I never had any trouble with it at work, but on my nights off call, I would lean too heavily on that scotch. And but looking back on it all, I was grateful for having been born alcoholic and then going through the process of wrestling with it and getting away from it. And likewise, my adoption abandonment wound came to a beautiful kind of answer of fruition and of completion after my NDE, especially if people who recognize that whole gigantic story of the guardian angel and how she was part of my life, but I didn't know that before. But it's because she was part of my birth family. And that was something that I wasn't privy to for so many years of my life. And only as I put all these pieces together did I discover it all. But again, the main point being that the hardships and challenges in many ways are the gifts that give us the growth and transformation as souls. And that was something that becomes very clear when you're going through this kind of life review in that realm where things are so much grander and your entire life is put in context with other lifetimes that you might lead, all in the process of soul growth.
Okay, so you mentioned reincarnation, past lives. How can we recognize or remember these past lives?
I think there are several different ways to access those memories. I mean, there's obviously a huge community of transpersonal psychology who use hypnotic regression and things like that to help people get induced into memories of past lives. But you can also remember them, for example, from having a near-death experience or a spontaneous epiphany in this life, and it'll bring back memories of what happened during a previous event. In fact, it's a pretty common story for people who have a near-death experience as an adult to recognize that they actually had a near-death experience as a child, very young child, and often they didn't come back with any memories of that. But after the adult NDE, they recover memories of the childhood NDE. That's just another example of the issues of memory of NDEs. And, when people have a heart attack and don't remember anything, is that a failure of remembering things that did happen, or did nothing really happen? And so I would say often it's a case of memory failure, and they're not necessarily bringing back the information. And that is what this whole program forgetting is all about, that there's some kind of gatekeeper that seems to allow us to bring some knowledge back to this world, but some things are not brought back at this time. So we're not really ready for them. But hypnotic regression, of spontaneous experience, and also meditation. Meditation is a powerful way to help bring our attention to events that might have happened during an NDE or something like that, or past life memories. In fact, I've had multiple times in my meditations. I use sacred acoustics. Anybody who wants to learn more, go to sacredacoustics.com. It's a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. That was something I was attracted to beginning about 2 years post-coma. I knew I had to explore consciousness. I knew I had to develop a powerful mode of meditation. And I heard about binaural beats, read an article in Scientific American 1974 about how binaural beats were generated in the brain by slightly different frequencies to the two ears. And because they intersect in the lower brainstem, at the superior olivary nucleus complex, that's why I believe they can have such a powerful effect on helping to set our conscious awareness free from the illusion of here, now, and sense of self. So meditation, centering prayer, these are all important ways of going within, exploring mind, and coming into connection with memories that can be of our past lived experiences.
Do you listen to this music or to these sounds in the evening before you go to sleep, or before you wake up? What's the best time?
I usually listen late in the morning. So in other words, I'll get up, usually get up around 6 or so, get all the things done I have to do in the morning. And then often kind of mid to late morning is a very good time for me because I'm not exhausted, and I can just go in and have a very kind of lively interaction of relaxation. Important thing to point out is the goal of meditation is to acknowledge that you are not that little voice in your head. So many people say, I am that running stream of thoughts in my head. That is who I am. That's my consciousness. No, that is a parlor trick. I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head your annoying roommate. That's a very good way to look at it. This is about discovering a part of yourself. That's your ego mind. And your ego mind plays a little role in kind of protecting the body and keeping it going and things like that. But the ego mind really gets in the way for any kind of deep spiritual work, because as you dive deep into near-death experiences and similar experiences, past life investigations, etc., you find that we're much more than that little ego voice. And that's why, for me, Sacred Acoustics is a very powerful way. When I do a meditation, that little ego voice in my mind can state a request, ask a question, what have you. Maybe ask about past lives or ask about something from a recent meditation to give me more of an idea of what it all means. But then I go into time out in terms of that little voice in my head. And I've learned to ride those Sacred Acoustics tones. If you listen to them, you'll know what I mean. There's a kind of a wavering wah, 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 wah sound to the back of them in the background. And that is what is driving those circuits in your lower brainstem. And what you'll find is that those sounds of Sacred Acoustics provide a very ready ability for you to leave that little voice in your head behind. Those thoughts can keep on running, but you don't have to pay attention to them. And that's where I think Sacred Acoustics is very powerful. And even if you're just looking for a tremendously proven technique for alleviating anxiety, Sacred Acoustics is extremely powerful. There was a medical case, not a case report, but a pilot study by Dr. Anna Yusum in her busy psychiatric practice in New York that was published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases back in February of 2020. And that pilot study showed a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms in people who listened to Sacred Acoustics over 2 weeks versus only a 7% reduction in people who over those 2 weeks had standard talk psychotherapy. So very powerful effect for just listening to these tones through headphones. And the tones that were used in that study, the whole mind bundle, is available at a reduced price, $19, and there's a free option that Karen put on there on her sacredacoustics.com website for the whole mind bundle early in the pandemic. That study came out, as you note, in early 2020, I think February, and that was the beginning of the pandemic. And Karen realized a lot of people are going to need help from anxiety, and those tones were a beautiful solution. And so many thousands of people have taken advantage of that download. And as I said, she's left it available for anybody who's in financial hardship so that they can get it for free. Right there at sacredacoustics.com. But if you try that whole mind bundle out, I think you'll see where this is going. There's also a free 20-minute OM download on the website.
You mentioned that every NDE experience, every near-death experience is individually tailored. Now, this gateway valley that you've seen, do you think it's been tailored to you specifically so you can see that visual?
Yeah, I think that what I witnessed was all for me only. And but the thing is, when you study these things by the hundreds and thousands, you find the very similar themes. In fact, especially when you reflect on the many different medical situations that bring people to this point, it's astonishing how common and similar the realms seem when you study them in large numbers. And that's where Bruce Grayson and work of similar individuals, the IANDS.org, International Association of Near-Death Studies, the Research Foundation's NDERF.org of Dr. Long, the doctors Long, Jody, and they've done an incredibly good job at NDERF.org of accumulated a large number of near-death experiences and studying them, analyzing them as a group. And when we do that, from a scientific standpoint, you start to realize they're indicating a realm that's very real. This is not like, different imaginary hallucinations. You got to remember, though, that one's prior religious beliefs, although they do not influence the content of what you have, they will influence often how people report them and talk about them. So the references that people use in talking about their experience can end up referring to things that they believed before from their religious systems. But very importantly, the content can be totally new. And for example, in my situation, I grew up in a Methodist church in North Carolina, very conservative kind of religious teachings. There was no room at all for being one with God, which was an absolute concrete piece of my experience deep in the core. And also no thought whatsoever of reincarnation, that our souls come back again and again in a process of coming to oneness with that divine force. That was never a religious concept I would have considered from any of my religious teachings. And yet it was crystal clear to me from my near-death experience that reincarnation is absolutely part of the fabric. There's no denying it. And that's why I was so amazed to discover all the scientific evidence for reincarnation from University of Virginia, Carol Bowman, Jim Matlock, other investigators. So there are a whole bunch of people who've been studying these things and contributing to the scientific literature.
We talked about this gateway valley that you've seen, that you found yourself in. I interviewed a person just a couple days ago, a person who went to hell, and he described that in such a graphic detail. So now, do you think that was tailored specifically for him, that experience, or he had this expectation to get in hell?
Well, I think most of the stories like that I've heard have come from people who had, a life review where when they kind of witnessed the events of their life and how they treated other people, it was very hellish. So basically, they kind of generated their own hell by the way they behaved and treated other people, and then had to experience that on the receiving end during a life review. From my perspective, and based on all my experience, there's no way there's an eternal hell and damnation for any soul at all. That's not to say that some souls might have a far more arduous life review. For example, Hitler. He would have to go through every bit of what was involved in the death of 53 million people who died during World War II, which he instigated, and also all the other kind of soul ramifications beyond just those that died in the conflict, but those that were injured, harmed, hurt, lost loved ones, etc. And so that's what he would have to go through is his life reviews. Is incredibly uh, dense and uh, loaded package of kind of hell experiences. But he was the generator of it all. That his soul line generated that line of possibility. So I think that it's very much that these are here to teach us. And they're generally teaching us this lesson of love, of compassion and kindness and mercy. And so for those who have been far from that ideal in their lifetime, greedy, selfish, causing pain and suffering, what have you, yeah, their life review is not going to be a very fun experience. It'll give them an idea of hell, but it's something that they kind of brought on themselves because this is all about our, uh, you know, being real about our relationship with the universe. We exist, and we exist for a reason. And that reason is to learn and grow and to teach and to, as much as possible, bring that love from the spiritual realm into this realm. And I think that's where the science of consciousness is really changing the game. Religions have had thousands of years to teach us the golden rule. And they've sometimes done a great job, sometimes not. Religious ideologies are not always filled with love, compassion, kindness, mercy, and acceptance. When they are, they're on the right pathway. But today, there's some religious ideologies that have fallen way away from love and kindness, compassion. They become very exclusive, very judgmental, and make life tough on other groups of people. That obviously is a religion that's gone sour and fallen off the vine. We need, spirituality. I would say spirituality for me has a very simple definition. One is that we're all connected through this mind, which is crystal clear through near-death experiences. Things like telepathy, more than 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences. One can burn their finger on a stove, the other develops a blister 1,000 miles away. That's how strong the telepathy is there. But all of us can have a mental connection like that. And that's really what all this is about, is acknowledging that spirituality involves this connectedness through the mental, as well as a sense of shared meaning and shared purpose with the universe at large and with our fellow beings. And so the science of consciousness is actually here to teach us a much more unified approach to life than the simplistic, bleak and paltry fiction of materialism that pretends we're all separate beings and that there's competition. Who has the most toys when they die wins, or some idiocy like that. That has nothing to do with the deeper reality conveyed from near-death experiences, that it's all about love and taking care of each other, taking care of the least, the last, and the lost. And certainly in the modern era, that includes refugees, people who are fleeing persecution and violence in their own countries. I mean, we need to all be taking care of each other. And that's kind of the ultimate lesson of this science of consciousness and the deep lessons of near-death experiences.
Okay, you just mentioned Hitler. A lot of people would not accept the notion that Hitler went to heaven as well. This is first part of my question. Second part of my question is this. Why this experience causing the death of 40-something million people was given to Hitler? Even if it was given to him, why such a high price to learn something? He came here, as you said, to evolve and to learn compassion or whatever. And that was a kind of high price for one person, for one soul to learn. Did he have this soul agreement with 45 million people before he came to Earth?
Well, I don't know exactly how to answer that, except to say that what ended up happening was a situation where there was a tremendous amount of collective misery. Collective gift of desperation is another way of putting it, and kind of brings to mind the whole world of addiction literature. Um, and how addiction is kind of a disease of the ego. And in many ways, I mean, what you see with someone like Hitler, uh, or in the modern world, I would include Putin in the same category, is someone who can really kind of challenge the world at large, bring incredible hardship and suffering to humanity. And I think what that ultimately does is it nudges us in an opposite direction. It nudges us towards love, compassion, and kindness, because people respond to the evils and horrors of World War II with a recoil. They don't want to repeat that. We want to learn from history. And so, in many ways, that was the gift of this hardship of World War II that Hitler gifted the world with, was people shying away from that and learning that is not the way to treat people. We learn through experience. We learn through kind of personal experience of living these lives. And so, in many ways, I would say that that was what that horrific hardship of World War II and Hitler's kind of personal journey brought to this world at large. And yet, sadly, in the current era, it looks like our memory is short. And that's why we sometimes need reminders. But ultimately, I think that this course of kind of dancing close with the autocrats and the narcissists kind of running countries, especially with such military power that you can really wreak havoc on other people's lives. I think ultimately all of that is going to teach us that we need to live together harmoniously. And that ultimately that will come out of these hardships, of these dances where we come close to major world warfare and conflict and violence and people dying. It turns out when you do the numbers, the 20th century had far more battlefield losses and deaths and civilian deaths due to war, et cetera, than we've seen in the 21st century. But sadly, the 21st century is now trying to rear its head in that direction. And this is where I would hope that the science of consciousness, this awakening of people to acknowledging this oneness of mind and how we're all in this together, will ultimately serve as an antidote to these kind of deep and pathological dances with autocrats and dictators running countries and enslaving people and murdering people. We've got to move away from all that. And I think that the more that this kind of message gets out to the world in a pure form, the more it helps to drive us in that direction. But of course, there's a lot of misinformation in the world too. It's a time of confusion. And I would say a lot of that is due to the political polarization and the battles we have going on. And in many ways, it's a battle for the soul of the world. And that soul involves awakening to this deep sense of interconnection that we share with each other, as opposed to following the vision of those autocrat narcissists, military leaders who are trying to subjugate other people in their country and in neighboring countries with warfare and with brutality. And ultimately, I think that the lesson for humanity will elevate us above, once and for all of this kind of tribal and nationalistic kind of polarization and friction and conflict.
Okay, you just mentioned that there is a battle for the soul of the world. Now, who do you think is waging this battle?
Well, I would say in many ways, it's in terms of philosophy, it's really the materialists, and the materialists happen to be often agnostic, militant atheists, and versus those who recognize that there's really a truth to an idea of soul and that we're all interconnected mentally. That this notion of telepathy and all the evidence we have for non-local consciousness and interaction of consciousness is showing us that we're really sharing one mind. This is the deep theme of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that Karen Newell and I wrote back in 2017. And we use consilience. Consilience is the notion that if you look at a deep problem, and here the problem would be the nature of consciousness, and you look at it from many different perspectives, if they all suggest the same answer, maybe you should pay attention. So the consilience of this discussion of consciousness, as we covered in Living in a Mindful Universe, addresses neuroscience, the hard problem of consciousness, but also the philosophy of mind and the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness in an individual, which is pretty impossible to explain if you're a pure materialist, thinking it's all neuronal populations. And then all the evidence for non-local consciousness, not just telepathy, as I mentioned, but remote viewing. Um, uh, these are all examples of how our mind has access to information beyond the ken of our physical senses and beyond the limited kind of version of self and here and now. And so when you look at consciousness from all these different directions, and especially when you include quantum physics, because quantum physics is one of the biggest voices over the last century, screaming at us that consciousness is unified, that we're sharing one mind. That's the deepest interpretation of the measurement paradox and of different understandings of modern quantum physics. Is it's trying to show us that kind of deep reality. So, in this sense, with consilience of all these different lines of inquiry, they're all telling us that mind is primary. It's not generated by the brain in a local fashion. And the awarding of the Nobel Prize in Physics for entanglement back in 2022 was especially important in marking this step forward for science, because by acknowledging entanglement, they're finally leaving behind the four-dimensional space-time of materialist science and saying there's other information connection in the universe that goes beyond our normal kind of notions of space-time. And in fact, it's what is known as local realism that really hits the chopping block with entanglement. And local realism, local is the notion that all physics is the interaction of particles. So when I look at a distant star, it's the photon from that star hitting my retina. It's a local interaction that allows that information to be conveyed. And the other important thing is the concept of realism. Realism is that objective physical reality exists independently of the observing mind. And what you find is with entanglement, no, that's just not true. There is no objective physical reality independent of that observing mind. And this is where idealism and notions of panentheism are so important, because they wake us up to the bigger reality that we're sharing a consciousness, and it's really the mind of the universe, and we're all in this together. And the binding force is one of love and compassion and kindness. All of these principles will greatly revolutionize that simplistic, bleak and paltry fiction of materialism, which is often also wed with a Darwinian sense of, survival of the fittest and competition, as opposed to what biologists will tell you today, that most of biology is really a result of collaboration and cooperation between members of a species and between species, and not this kind of mythical and militant, survival of the fittest and competition. So it's a much bigger story than that.
Okay, so you mentioned that you had to come back into this dimension from the other side. Why do you think you were sent back? Did you have the purpose to write these books, to teach these teachings that you are sharing right now? What is the main purpose of you coming back?
I think it was really an acknowledgement of love. I mean, ultimately, that you find that is the reason that NDEers come back to this world. When you pay attention to these stories in detail, is it's always about a loving connection, a sense of responsibility to come back for another soul. It shows you that the important currency of our existence is our connections with other souls and how we treat each other. That is the important thing. It's not the material wealth that we might accumulate. Turns out when you study near-death experiences by the thousands, you find that near-death experiencers come back to this world less materialistic, more spiritual, less religious. That's a very important point, but more spiritual. And spiritual, again, has to do with this sense of being connected with each other through that mental space, and a sense of shared meaning and purpose with the universe at large. And I think it was that simple. Came back for love. It had to do with the love of bond of my son and recovering that deep sense. It had to do with the love connecting me to my birth family, that missing piece for the first half century of my life. Really connecting so many dots and making so much more sense of it all. And plus having a real sense of meaning and purpose in my life. I mean, before, I was interested in learning much more about brain-mind consciousness as a neurosurgeon, but with this much grander vision and understanding based on my NDE, it's really about sharing this kind of deep and profound knowledge with the world at large. So in essence, that's basically why I came back, although it was really for the personal reasons of personal growth. But ultimately, that kind of thing can also contribute to growth of our culture and society.
I think I already got the answer to this question I'm going to ask you, but let me ask you again one more time. What was the most profound change in you that happened after that experience?
Well, I would say it was a great sense of comfort that all is well. In fact, my youngest sister, Phyllis, tells me a funny story. As I said, when I woke up from coma, they pulled out the breathing tube, and then I was in and out of 36 hours of paranoid delusional psychotic delusion. Things were very rocky. My brain was still affected by all this. But the interesting thing is, Phyllis told me she arrived maybe 20 or 30 minutes after they pulled the breathing tube out. And she said I was sitting there on the bed like a little Buddha. And I would look at each person around me, look them in the eyes and say, don't worry, all is well. Doctors, nurses, family, didn't matter. Don't worry, all is well. And she said it was so amazing to have this guy who they had for the last week thought was at risk of dying. And even when coming back, we were worried he's not really going to come back. His brain's going to be mush. And there I was reassuring all of them that everything is fine. You have nothing to worry about at all. And that really, I think, kind of hits the nail on the head. Is since I've come back, I've realized how comforting this beautiful message of eternity of soul and connected into the soul and binding force of love and a very real, concrete God force at the core of the universe that is loving and non-judgmental. I mean, these are all very good pieces of news for each and every one of us as you come to explore and discover this on your own. So I would say that's really the best thing is coming to this notion of all is well and living it. And that's what I try and do in doing all these podcasts and interviews and presentations and conferences and meetings is trying to help people realize that the deep, true story of our existence is one that has a lot of comfort with it and is very reassuring. And this is not just wishful thinking, but this is based on the scientific data of rigorous analysis of all manner of human experiences.
Okay, doctor, are you still full-time doctor at this time, or are you just mostly doing something else?
Well, no, I discovered, I started giving talks about my experience 2 years before Proof of Heaven came out. And it was, so that was in, 2010 that I was giving talks and later. And my life was getting very busy around these talks. And I was still seeing some neurosurgical patients, but I realized you can't do neurosurgery part time. So I had to make a decision, and I made that decision in June of 2012. That was 4 months before Proof of Heaven came out. But things were getting so busy with sharing my story of my coma journey and all of its deep and important lessons that I converted to doing that full time. I had to leave neurosurgical practice behind, which I regretted. I love neurosurgery, fantastic field. I still hear from a lot of my patients, including some who were supposed to die of malignant tumors back in the 1990s, but we were able to, rescue with our medical efforts. Still hear from some of those patients, and it's very gratifying. It was one of the greatest aspects of my life was helping people with malignant brain tumors, strokes, head injury, what have you. And yet, this is what I had to do. It's what I was meant to do. It became clear to me that I was not to continue just slugging it out in the operating room every day, battling these tumors and strokes, et cetera, but that I really had a bigger mission. And that's a huge part of why I went to coma and why I came back from coma, was to share this story.
So there was a change of profession for you. When do you think you were more useful to the humanity? When you were a doctor, when you became an author and a speaker?
Well, I think what I'm doing now and have been for the last, you know, 10 or so years since Proof of Heaven came out, there is a 10th anniversary edition of Proof of Heaven out now that has 36 additional pages in it that explain a lot of what's happened, in those 15 years since my coma. And there's no question in my mind that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. There's also no question that all those years spent in neurosurgery were absolutely critical for this. I wouldn't have any of this level of understanding of it all if I hadn't spent, 25 years in active neurosurgical investigation.
You mentioned that there are scientific studies about reincarnation. Can you bring a couple examples, please?
Well, they're mainly what I would do is steer you to Jim Tucker's book. Jim Tucker's doing the current work on this, and he's got a book called Before, and that book is all about the various settings that people have these events occur in. But probably one of the best ones for people to study, and this is Jim Tucker vetted, is the case of James and Andrea Leininger. And James is the son. Bruce and Andrea Leininger wrote the book. It's called Soul Survivor. And I can highly recommend that book. There are hundreds of you know, data points that line up that are absolutely astonishing, that show that this World War II fighter pilot who died in March of 1945 in the Battle of Iwo Jima and was reincarnated 53 years later in Louisiana as a young boy in April of 1998. And the story is amazing. And as I said, it's been vetted by Jim Tucker, so it's been cleared as a very believable and powerful story. And once you start studying these things, it's just amazing that this whole world has ignored so much of this. I mean, Ian Stevenson was a very respected investigator, and yet the world, certainly in the 20th century, was not ready to make this gigantic leap to understanding of the reality of reincarnation. And I think right now the world is getting ready because the facts are there, the stories keep emerging, and the world is changing.
Okay, so you said the world is changing. Do you think there is a big awakening happening right now?
I think there is a very big awakening happening right now, but it's the kind that will be so subtle that we will keep having these little skirmishes and discussions and flashpoints, and then finally everybody will say, "Well, we've always known this, always known this. We never denied it." Well, they'll deny the fact that they're currently denying it, but that's fine as long as they wake up ultimately. And the data only leads in one direction.
Now, if people want to find more about you, about your work, about what you do, about your books, where can they do that?
Go to Eben, EBEN Alexander.com. I especially recommend the recommended reading list, the FAQ page, and also their listings of many interviews and conversations, etc. All that's at EbenAlexander.com. Also, don't miss the 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. It's a free drip email campaign that will get you vastly up to speed quickly on the big concepts of our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe.